The two Death Knights in Ludmilla's escort hefted the largest trunk that had been carried over to the side of the road onto their shoulders. It had been trimmed of its branches, but the 12-meter-long section of aspen still looked remarkably heavy. She kept looking down at the dirt road as they descended to the valley floor in front of their procession, expecting deep footprints to be left in their wake, though all they left were some shallow imprints in the mostly dry soil. She would need to see about laying stronger roads soon, or the dirt path would become a rugged nightmare with so many heavy loads being transported upon it. Several wisps of smoke rose from the village in the distance. They were too voluminous to be cookfires from the homes, and there had been no panicked villagers coming up the road to raise the alarm, so she thought it must be Ostrich starting his charcoal production. With the skies being uncharacteristically clear for the past few days, the waters of the Katza River had receded somewhat. She directed the Death Knights to use the shallow ford that had appeared behind the bridge, not wanting to risk the wooden structure's collapse. As the carts crossed, she saw that a section of the reeds and grasses growing along the shore nearby had already been cleared away. She didn't see anyone working below, however. The women of the village must have stopped to prepare the evening meal. Large piles of wood and various pieces of burnable debris had appeared on the hillside, and bone vultures flying back and forth from the fields periodically added more to them. The sense that her domain was slowly coming back to life gave her a feeling of energy that further contributed to her good mood. After the Death Knights dropped off the log on the sandy flats, Ludmilla parked the carts near the piles of wood and had the undead transfer the contents of the carts to them. Walking up to the village, she found Amelia standing at the entrance with a moist towel in hand. "Welcome back, my lady." Her maid lowered her head as she offered the towel for Ludmilla to refresh herself with. "Did something happen?" Ludmilla stopped wiping her hands and looked at her maid, puzzled. "A few things happened." "What do you mean?" Amelia pointed her finger and Ludmilla looked down. Her legs were encrusted in green and brown muck up to the knee. "Oh, I went into the marsh to see if the undead could do something." "I will prepare a change of clothes, my lady." Amelia's maintained her even and respectful tone, yet Ludmilla felt like she was being scolded for some reason. She retreated to her manor to change before any other flaws with her appearance could be found from the short trek through the nearby valley. After an early supper, she checked on the smith's progress. She found Ostrich tending to several large, smoldering mounds near to the woodpiles below where he had set up his forge the previous evening. "Is this how charcoal is made?" she asked from the side as she watched the lazy trails of smoke travel south over the river. Ostrich hadn't been paying attention to his surroundings and started looking up from his work. He scowled for a moment, before he realized who had spoken. "Yes, Lady Zaradnik," he said as he rose to face her. "It'll take about a week before anything comes out of it, though. Normally, you'd build a kiln away from everyone to keep the fumes away, but the wind is so consistent here that this spot will do for now. I'd still recommend building one if you plan on producing charcoal for the long term, though." She wasn't sure that she would. Just glancing over Ostrich's work, it felt like he was going through a lot of wood. Her own plans currently only extended to clearing enough farmland for 5 villages, then seeing what she could do about turning the harbor village into a town. The smith turned back to continue tending to the mounds, making holes and filling them in some sort of strange ritual. "How long will what you have here last you?" Ludmilla asked. "Just this." He looked around at the mounds. The one nearest to the village was small compared to the others, standing about a meter high and 3 meters across. The others were much larger, each around twice her height and over 10 meters across. "This small one here is to just tide me over until the big ones are done. I might have to get another one started, just to be safe. Once the large ones are finished, I'll be good with that portable forge until late next spring, probably. The bigger we make the new forge and furnace, the more it'll burn, obviously, but I can't say how much until we actually build it." Ludmilla didn't have the slightest clue what went into building one, or building anything, really. She thought she might be able to fish out some information from Ostrich, whose traveling lifestyle seemed to have made him quite knowledgeable. "What will you need before you can start on that?" she asked. "Carpenters, masons, depends on how fancy you want it made," the smith answered. "If you want something with all the bells and whistles, you'll be looking at involving alchemists and other magical crafters, too. You're set on materials here already. Speaking of which, I brought up some of the ore I was talking about from the marsh." Ostrich finished his rounds and led her back up to the forge. The smith had fashioned a long wooden ladder, using it to climb directly up to his workplace. Ludmilla looked down at it after scaling up after him. "Make sure you don't leave that there," she warned him. "Why's that?" "We're on the edge of the wilderness," Ludmilla said. "Attacks can come at any time. The last thing we need is someone conveniently putting out a ladder for invaders to climb." "I mean no disrespect, Baroness," the smith said as he looked to the Death Knight escorts who had crawled up the ladder after her, "but I don't think you'll have to worry about that with so many of these undead here." Ludmilla did not like his flippant response. As long as she lacked properly trained sentries and patrols to secure the borders again, it was all too easy to sneak into her territory through any number of routes. "The village was attacked 2 days ago," she tried to keep her tone even but couldn't prevent the edge from entering her voice. "A solar intruder made it to the base of the village completely undetected and killed my warehouse manager." Ostrich turned around at her statement with an expression of disbelief. After meeting her gaze for a moment, he lowered his head. "Apologies, my lady," he said solemnly. "I forgot myself." In the silence that followed, a skeleton walked by carrying a bucket filled with clay. It passed the 2 humans and deposited its load in a pile behind the smith before returning down the path it had come from. It cared little for their interaction, blithely carrying on with its task. Ludmilla looked past Ostrich to the pile. There was a short ring of the material fashioned beside it. "A bloomery," the smith answered the question on her face. "It's a simple furnace for smelting iron ore. I've been putting it together between checking the charcoal piles." Ostrich walked over to a pile of ruddy orange rocks which looked to be as wet as the mud nearby. The pieces were of varying sizes, a few were larger than her head. "This is the ore I was talking about," he said somewhat proudly. "I'll take your word for it, but it just looks like a rock from the marsh." "Well, technically it is a rock from your marsh," Ostrich replied. "This is called bog iron. It's easy to extract and easy to find in places like this. When no one's been harvesting it, the stuff just keeps piling up." "Harvest?" Ludmilla tilted her head. "Do you mean to say that you can grow iron?" Not in the sense that you can grow crops or raise livestock." Ostrich looked down at the pile of ore. "An old shaman I met out east just beyond Karnassus tried to explain it to me, something about spirits in the water gathering iron or some such. I don't know how true that is, as I've never seen anything that looks like a spirit or a fairy or whatever while picking this stuff up. What is true is that it does appear in places like this." He said that areas with bog iron could be harvested once every few decades, so it's a slow thing. Ludmilla's gaze turned to the familiar marshes of her home. They stretched far to the north, and took up 2/3 of her land. The villagers had long since come to appreciate and harness the productivity of the valley in terms of its vegetation and wildlife, but they had never known there was such mineral wealth as well. She must have gone by similar lumps of ore thousands of times while traversing the marshes throughout her life. "So when you said there was enough iron here to build a small city, you weren't exaggerating?" "No, my lady," he grinned. "A family could make their livelihoods collecting ore and selling it, and they'd probably never run out with this much area to cover. It'd be a different story if you established a foundry here and started exporting your products, of course, but I meant what I said yesterday. Your territory has a balance of all the right things, as long as you know what to look out for. Even as much as I've seen in all my travels, there are probably people out there that'll notice things that I haven't." "That's very encouraging to hear." Ludmilla turned back with a nod and a slight smile. "I'm glad you decided to come work for me, Mr. Kovalev." "Pleasure's all mine, Lady Zaradnik. It feels good to be useful, especially in a promising place like this." Another skeleton walked by with its bucket of clay, depositing it with a splat. Their eyes followed it as it came and went. "Have you tried using the skeletons to find ore?" "Sure did," he laughed. "It was the first thing I tried. Thought I'd have it easy, but they can't tell anything apart. Even scooping up this clay is hit and miss. Sometimes I get mud and rocks, other times a clump of roots with a plant attached." "What have you found them useful for, then? Besides carrying mud around?" "Carrying wood around." He raised his hands disarmingly when Ludmilla frowned a bit at his words. "They're tireless, so they're ideal for pumping bellows as well. As long as you have the fuel, The furnace that you build in the future should be able to easily turn out steel if it's designed to harness the labor of a group of skeletons operating a set of bellows. They can swing hammers too. I guess that's a given since skeletons always seem to carry weapons around, but I prefer to do that part myself. They're not too great at working together with me and it breaks my flow constantly. I mostly have them moving things around for now. Maybe I'll come up with other ideas later. Make sure you report your findings to Nonna when you get the chance, Ludmilla told him. Before I get going, I've a load of equipment that needs repairs. Sure, let's have a look. Ludmilla motioned for one of the Death Knights to pick up the crate that she had delivered earlier to the warehouse nearby. It returned after a few minutes, placing it on the ground between them. Ostrich let out a sigh even as the crate was laid on the ground. What's wrong? Ludmilla asked worriedly. The smith picked up one of the broken tools, a shovel blade with a large chunk missing, leaving a sharp edge behind. This is cast iron, he said simply. Is that bad? Ludmilla asked. It's not something I can fix with what I have here, the smith said. Cast iron is brittle and can't be reworked like forged iron or steel, it just goes everywhere if you even try. Doesn't mean that you've been cheated, though, it just means that whoever made these thought they were tight on time so they chose a method that could turn out a lot of equipment quickly. Ludmilla considered the smith's words. Forge Master Mesmet's account did match Ostrich's assessment of what had happened. Knowing this did not help her at all, though. What can be done, then? She asked. Well, if you're desperate for replacements, he answered, you'll have to return to the city to buy them. The scrap here can be sold to the forgers in the city that can do something about it. If you think you can hold out, I would say keep the scrap here and we can turn it into steel when the forge furnace is ready. Since there should be enough spare equipment to finish the fieldwork, saving the materials to make steel tools sounded like a good idea. They would be far more durable and could be repaired, and having the work done locally meant she would ultimately save on the costs of purchasing them from the city. I'll leave you to your work then, Mr. Kovalev. She decided she had taken up enough of the smith's time. We can hold on to this scrap until it can be turned into steel. Hopefully I'll be able to find who I need to start construction work soon. Ostrich waved absently as he returned to fashioning the bloomery. With most of what she had planned out for the day completed, she looked forward to the free time she would have to practice her skills with her new equipment. Approaching the warehouse, she slowed her steps when she noticed Nonna had returned. Did Mr. Bohr speak with you about his findings? Ludmilla asked. He did, Nonna replied without looking up from her work. After everything that's come to light, Ludmilla said, I'm curious about what went into the information provided by the administration's materials. You mentioned that Carney didn't have the same issues with equipment failure, yet the recommendations provided for spare equipment actually line up with our losses so far. Then there's the yield estimates. They are far beyond what a farming village in this duchy can produce, yet the numbers seem without variation or expectations accompanying them. Why is that? Nonna's pen stopped scratching, and the elder lich looked up at her quietly. The answer is as you have probably already surmised, she said. You knew that the information was this unreliable? Ludmilla frowned. It was not until today that I requested the source materials, Nonna replied, due to all the discrepancies that I personally observed on the field. The components that went into the data provided by the almanacs are from various sources conducted under different circumstances, thus my creation of the new control sample that we spoke of earlier today. Doesn't that mean we practically went in blind on this? No wonder the lease was free. Data is data, Nonna said flatly. The available data was that which was collected from past records of the region, some information from Carney Village and experimental results provided by the Imperial Ministry of Magic. Every action taken using the available materials is a hypothesis through which further observations are made possible, where information is proven or disproven and ultimately added to the Sorceress Kingdom's archives. As observations are collected, knowledge expands. As knowledge expands, rules, procedures and formulas are established. Anomalies that challenge our perception of the world inevitably present themselves, and so observations are made and knowledge expands once more. At least this is something one of my seniors has said. I didn't know elder liches had seniors, Ludmilla said bemusedly. Who said this? Titus Annius Secundus, chief librarian of Ashurbanipal, one of the leading researchers of the Sorceress Kingdom. He sounds like an interesting person, Ludmilla said. Maybe I'll be able to visit this library one day. That is highly unlikely, Nonna told her. You have neither the permission nor the qualifications to enter. Ludmilla smirked at Nonna's flat refusal. Walking past her, she entered the warehouse to put away the produce she had returned with, in addition to the basket of fish that the captain had apparently succeeded in catching from the river. Scanning the shelves to find a place to arrange everything, an object in the near corner caught her eye. It was a large, glossy black box of unknown construction which stood around the height of her knee. A strip of paper scrawled with unknown writing sealed the container. Eyes wide, she looked back to Nonna standing beside the entrance outside, who once again seemed to be busy writing in her comb. Was this always here? Ludmilla asked. No, it arrived several hours ago, the elder lich said. How did it get inside? It was delivered, by order of the royal treasurer. By who? Nonna did not answer, continuing her work in silence. Ludmilla knelt in front of the box, running a hand over its smooth surface. She hesitated for a moment before pulling open the seal and lifting the lid. With the noise of bones clattering against one another, a familiar-looking skeleton rose and formed itself, the lens of its golden monocle reflecting the afternoon light coming in from the warehouse door. Good day, madam. It bowed slightly at the waist as it greeted her. How may I be of assistance? Concealed by the shadowy interior of the guest manor, Pandora's actor leaned against the wall of his bedroom, watching the streets below through its windows. It was a pleasant afternoon in the city, though traces of the spring rain still remained over the glistening cobblestones. A pair of death knights strode by on their patrol of the central district, their heavy footfalls resonating through the air. A short ways away, there was a small group of nobles which trailed behind, accompanied by their servants on their way to conduct their business somewhere. The sight was a satisfying one, proof that the efforts that had been poured into revitalizing the city and its surrounding territories were truly beginning to take hold. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Shiltir Bloodfallen had agreed to join hands with him in his work, 3 weeks since the stormy night when he had been struck by the epiphany that now lay at the core of all his efforts with the citizens of the realm. He had reworked the approach by which he now encouraged the people, and reflection on his previous actions in comparison still made him chuckle ruefully to himself. He had ceased his shallow efforts to become an object of adulation, a proud figure that attempted to force the idea of bravery and resilience in all who laid eyes on him. Now, he had acted to become a constant in the eyes of the humans, interacting with them in a much more personal manner. He was no longer just an adventurer, he had become a friend to the people, a trusted confidant, a role model that led the citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom into the bright future that their new sovereign had in store for them. Slowly, but surely, the citizens responded to him. Through his encouragement, the people roused themselves from their fearful stupor and life returned to the duchy as inevitably as blossoms would greet the spring. The multitude of pebbles he had shifted out in the vast rural regions surrounding the city eventually turned into an avalanche. Tenants from hamlets created demand for the services of their respective villages, which in turn restarted trade and travel to and from the towns that serviced those villages. The flow of goods and labor eventually reached the capital of Irantal, first in a trickle, then a flood. It was startling to see how the entire city seemed to immediately come to life, as if its people had been rudely chased out of their beds by a bucket of ice water. The civilization built by the humans was both intricate and insidious in its functioning. All it had taken was a series of gentle nudges in the right places to stir it from its slumber. He had learned how to turn the key he had been given, as Shiltir had so poetically described it. As the parts of that lock tumbled and snapped into place, the people moved of their own volition to act out their roles. It seemed an irresistible thing to them, a part of their nature that they could not deny as they sought out a tiny, yet coveted position amongst their fellows. It mattered little what part they played, farmer or smith, noble or servant. All purpose was dictated by a system that had been refined over generations to suit the qualities and needs of their race. There were, of course, a few disenfranchised individuals amongst them, but they were by far a tiny minority. More, he realized, had their roles supplanted by various aspects of the Sorceress Kingdom that the Guardian Overseer saw fit to rearrange. It was something that had already come to pass and the damage had already been done, so he would need to keep an eye on things to ensure that as many as possible could partake in his master's vision for the realm. There was also the incorporation of the various non-human species that were already a part of the citizenry. With humans by far the majority of the realm's population, it seemed like the best option. The more intelligent of the non-human denizens would almost certainly adapt to find their place, but there were others that did not quite fit into the puzzle for one reason or another. That these weak beings were not as unsophisticated and chaotic as they initially seemed was a realization that was ever so slowly dawning on the other servants of Nazarick. That they would naturally pursue higher ideals of order had struck a chord with some, and was recognized as a trait to be exploited by others. There was no doubt in his own mind that it was something long understood and incorporated into his master's plans. Even when ruled over by one that was not of their own, they would inevitably and willingly come to embrace the order of the Sorceress Kingdom and commit themselves fully to its cause. How vast was his creator's intellect, knowing that not changing such a small thing would have a greater effect than 1,000 alterations and amendments by the Guardian Overseer. Everything slid so naturally into place when he followed his master's lead, with no resistance or complaint. The work of generations shortened to mere weeks. Surely one with such perfect understanding deserved to be called a supreme being. All there was to do now was to capitalize on this progress, but what did their master wish of them next? As he continued to ponder what his future steps would be, there was a soft knock at the door. In the blink of an eye, Pandora's actor took on the guise of Moman, equipping the adventurer's dark attire. As he did so he realized it was probably unnecessary, but he completed the action regardless. He lived alone in the manor most of the time, with Nobril only occasionally frequenting it for the sake of appearances. Moman's visitors would not be knocking at the door to this room, they would be ringing the bell to the manor and awaiting his answer outdoors. "Enter," he said. Surely enough, the figure of an eight-edged assassin appeared in the doorframe. It scuttled in and made a sort of bow, if such a form could be said to bow, and its mouthparts worked as it spoke. "Ein Summer has arrived to see you." Pandora's actor unconsciously straightened at the sound of his master's name. "Understood. You may return." After the door closed behind the eight-edged assassin, Moman's equipment and guise vanished from Pandora's actor, replaced by his sharp military uniform. His fingers fidgeted nervously as they roamed to ensure his attire was impeccable. Stepping in front of a body-length mirror, he flourished his cloak for effect and evaluated the results. His cap was not straight. Or was it? He moved to adjust it carefully, then decided to tilt it, thinking it might look more dashing that way. A hand went to his chin as he pondered his image, and then he straightened his cap again. His body moved from side to side, as if he could look around his reflection to catch a glimpse of himself from another angle. He rehearsed a few poses and gestures that he thought might be appropriate for a meeting with his creator and, suitably satisfied with what he had finally settled on, Pandora's actor strode to the door. It would not do to keep his master waiting. As he made his way out of his room and down the stairs, he scanned the hall that encircled the courtyard, looking from door to door until he spotted the only one being guarded, which led to the drawing room of the manor. He checked over himself one last time, tilting his hat, adjusting his lapels and straightening his tie as he mentally rehearsed his actions once again before rigidly knocking at the door. The door opened and he looked down to see the homunculus maid, Fifth. She did not meet his gaze and waited silently for him to make his entrance. Mustering all of his courage, Pandora's actor strode into the room grandly. "O Supreme One," he said boldly as his arms swept out before him, "my creator Ryan Summer. No need to greet me. Sit." "Yes." All thoughts of his carefully rehearsed movements instantly vanished as he clicked his heels together. He goose-stepped his way to the couch where the Supreme Overlord of Nazarick awaited him, and promptly seated himself. Pandora's actor sat stiffly as he felt his master's eyes closely evaluate him. Time seemed to stretch on in the silence as he did so he thought to fill in the space by engaging in the proper pleasantries. "May I ask?" "No, it's nothing, don't worry about it," his master interjected, and Pandora's actor immediately withdrew his words. "All right, I have some things to ask you. First, I'd like to know about Moman's condition. I know what you've reported to Albedo, so, are there any problems?" Aside from the die that he had cast a few weeks ago, the reports that he had given to Albedo had been, for the most part, progress reports regarding his efforts to restore the vitality of Eranthal. The former was the only real incident that could have qualified as irregular, as the latter was the role which he had been assigned. So did that mean that his master approved of his move to place the young noblewoman under Schultier? He supposed it must. Surely, it must be so, Considering the valuable sequence of outcomes that continue to manifest as a result, progressively branching and blossoming into a myriad of positive effects. It would seem there is nothing spec. Is that so? Pandora's actor was interrupted once again. Good. Then, I'd like to ask you, Pandora's actor, are there any problems on your end? It would seem that everything was going according to his master's plans. He relaxed somewhat, assured that his own actions had not run afoul of his creator's will, and pondered what sort of personal problems he might have to report. There was really only one thing, though in truth his zeal in achieving his goals had actually served as a sort of distraction from it. In truth, in summer. With the floodgates of his desire wrenched open at his master's prompting, the realization of what he had been missing the entire time came crashing down on him all at once. I have suffered greatly. As his emotions welled from within, he rose from his seat and rounded on his master. Surely, this was an act of the kindest regard, for his creator to be so acutely aware of his needs. He drew close, with one arm resting on the backrest of the couch and the other making animated gestures as he spoke. During this time, Pandora's actor said, I have not been able to touch magic items. Well, technically he had, though the magical conveniences of the human, such as enchanted containers and faucets of spring water, were a fraction of a pittance in comparison with what lay within the vaults of Nazarick, and thus did not even come close to satiating his urges. I have been unable to maintain the various magic items created by the Supreme Beings, he continued. The sorting of data crystals has ground to a halt as well. Please, no matter what, in summer, I beseech you to grant me some time with those items. Did I design you that way? Of that, there is no doubt. Pandora's actor proclaimed, these feelings were bestowed upon me by yourself, Momonga-sama. Did I not permit you to return to Nazarick every day? Momonga-sama returned after a momentary pause. But I have not received permission to return to the treasury. Pandora's actor returned periodically to the Great Tomb, but mainly for the purpose of creating undead servants out of the frozen corpses on the 5th floor once a day. Without the Ring of Ainzul gown, which he did not carry as he traveled about the realm as Momon due to security concerns, he could not enter the hallowed sanctum of the guild treasury. I understand, his master said. Then, I shall inform Shiltir and have her give the ring to you. In addition, I grant you permission to work on my comrades' weaponry and equipment. Do not damage them. The fact that he had mentioned Shiltir specifically gave Pandora's actor a split-second's pause. Due to their agreed-upon collaboration to achieve the ideal realm of their master, he and the Floor Guardian kept in regular contact with one another. Did the purposeful selection mean that their master knew well of what had transpired and had just given his tacit approval of their work? There was also the idea that she was one of the NPCs that had the ring who could also transport herself magically, but doing so by one of the others who could not was simply a matter of asking, so it must have meant the former. The thought that he had succeeded in discerning his master's wishes filled him with satisfaction once again. He straightened his hat and rose to offer a crisp salute. It shall. Stop that. Speaking normally will be fine. Didn't I tell you this before, Gem, Pandora's actor? Yes. The relationship between us is one of creator and created. The fact is, I am very happy with the way you have worked hard to show me the being I intended to make. However, sometimes I wonder, should children not work to exceed their parents? The fact that his work was being directly affirmed had the effect of being extremely gratifying. The idea that his creator considered Pandora's actor his own child filled him with overwhelming euphoria. Oh, in summer. To think you would refer to me as your child. Umu, his creator nodded. You are, my son, or something like that. That, how shall I put this, should most likely, that should be the case. Therefore, there's no need to use German or salute or be so dramatic in front of me. Since I made you, I want to see the parts of you that I did not make, as proof that you have grown. There was a sniffling sound in the background as Pandora's actor bowed, absorbing the edifying words from his creator. His creator? No. I understand, Father. Oh. I shall show you what you wish to see, Father, Pandora's actor declared. Pandora's actor. You must not tell anyone else of what has happened here. Understood? If people know that you're receiving special treatment, it might result in friction with the others. His father's voice was solemn. Also, In fact, because of that, I will be placing you lower on my priorities. If the time comes when I have to choose between helping you or the Floor Guardians, I will abandon you." It felt something of a relief that he was least on the list of his father's concerns. The vote of confidence filled him with pride, and he thrust out his chest after he rose to stand tall. "But of course. Please, sacrifice me as you see fit. I am sorry. And, fifth, do not speak of what has happened here." The homunculus maid attending to their master nodded in acknowledgement of the order. Heinz Ulgaun rose from his seat with a regal nod. "Then, I will be on my way." Understanding that absolutely no one was to know of their meeting, Pandora's actor locked away the precious memory in the treasury of his heart. He was now supremely assured that his work was as his father had wished of him. The Supreme Overlord of Nazarick knew what Pandora's actor had been doing, and had visited to personally deliver his approval. Still, there were many questions that lingered in his mind, questions which echoed in the voices of the people that he had become much more than just a hero to. He thought of the humble families of tenant laborers in their rural lands, of the craftsmen and shopkeepers in the settlements that they serviced, of the nobles who administered their fiefs and pioneered the new ways that would become the foundations of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. About that, he felt compelled to speak before they parted ways. "Could you hold on a little? Since we meet rarely, there is a matter that I would like to ask you, Father." Since his father had stated that he would now be focusing more on the others, Pandora's actor seized the opportunity to ask on the people's behalf. "May I know how you intend to rule this sorceress kingdom?" The serving girl shot him a glare. It was the fifth such glare that afternoon, that he had noticed, anyways, but Itzalverdi looked past her ire with disinterest as he nursed his drink in the furthest corner of the tavern. His lidded gaze scanned the common room, running over the sparsely occupied tables and then to the door of the building, which had been undisturbed for the past hour. For over a week he had been waiting to meet his associates, and the tavern itself had been the last in a long series of backups in case all of their other meeting spots had been compromised. And compromised they were, leveled, in fact. When he arrived in Erantal amongst the trickle of rural traffic coming in through the southern gate, he had taken a meandering route intended to confuse potential observers through the streets on the way to the slums of the city, only to find that all of the entrances to the district had been barred off. Under reconstruction, the words were plainly scrawled in bold on a large sign laid across every gate, accompanied by the seal of the city's new administration. He turned away from the undead sentries standing watch over the ways in and asked around, soon discovering from the locals that the entire section of the city had been cleared and was now undergoing conversion into a district for use by demi-humans. The thought made him recoil in disgust, yet the only visible mark of his displeasure was a slight turning down of a corner of his mouth. Preposterous. A city founded by humans becoming a teeming den of inhuman filth? He supposed the apostates that had turned away from their rightful gods deserved no less. Even so, it infuriated him that they didn't even seem to care that a huge swathe of their beloved city would simply be given away to a swarm of savage creatures. Itzal sighed, understanding that his own frustrations over the entire situation did nothing to alleviate his current problems. The slums were an ideal backdrop to run the operation that he was a part of, a section of the city that was barely monitored by the authorities and full of people that would willingly perform various tasks for little pay with no questions asked. Within, it was easy to hide and even easier to escape notice, a community full of individuals with various useful skill sets and networks which complemented his line of work. He might have expected one or two of the establishments where he was to meet with his fellows going under due to perfectly normal circumstances, but the idea that the whole damn thing would go up all at once was something that they had only considered as an afterthought in their contingency planning. What sane person would suddenly decide to tear up a whole quarter of a city, anyways? The serving girl shot another glare at him and Itzal decided that he had stayed for long enough. Unlike the seedy watering holes in the slums, the taverns that were in the main section in the city were too reputable. They were too open and too well lit, made to provide hospitality to merchants and well-to-do travelers. The patrons would try to connect with others and the staff would keep pestering you without your asking. Even trying to avoid notice would get you noticed, so one couldn't even act to obscure their identity as they waited at their tables. After days of waiting, it seemed pointless. He would have to figure out something else. Shoving open the door, Itzal didn't even bother to give the fuming waitress a second glance as he left the building. Taking a turn, he nearly bumped into a short, portly woman coming up the street. Their eyes met momentarily before he stepped back into the doorframe to stand aside, continuing on his way after she had passed. He turned into the alley behind the tavern and, a half-hour later, the same woman appeared from the other end of the alley. She made her way up to him, leaning on the shadowed wall across from where he stood. "About damn time," Itzal spat. "Can't be helped," the woman shrugged. "You know how it is." Itzal made a non-committal noise. Road traffic between Irantal had effectively ceased from the neighboring nations since its fall, making it difficult to travel unnoticed from abroad. He himself had been on standby in Croston, and it had taken more than 2 weeks before he felt it was safe to join the fresh trickle of local carts and wagons to enter the city. "I'm surprised the Eight Fingers moved at all," she continued. "Didn't even think they'd want to try and sink their teeth into this place, but I guess I was wrong. The leaders pushed to get a caravan together all of a sudden and sent it over with some pretty normal cargo. Probably trying to lay out their groundwork and set up shop, but I guess they got the same nasty surprise that we did." He made to reply, but shadows flickered across the ground as a pair of undead casters zipped through the sky over the alley for a split second. Uncertain whether they had been noticed, Itzal silently motioned for them to split up and meet at a safer location. They were together again an hour later, finding a freshly abandoned home deep in the back alleys. When he had first arrived in Irantal, this hidden area of the city had been crowded with the displaced denizens of the slums, but they had disappeared somewhere since then. It had happened quite suddenly. He returned from a day of waiting at the tavern and every man, woman and child had disappeared. All of the work he had laid out in the short time he had been in Irantal fell apart as well. Their homes were emptied, all evidence of their former residents absent, leaving buildings scoured clean, sitting in eerie and sterile silence. He couldn't tell if they had been violently whisked away, or slaughtered on the spot. They certainly hadn't walked away through the city streets, and the rest of the city was none the wiser. "Any sign?" the woman asked. "I haven't seen any of the others for days," Itzal answered. "You're the second to arrive after me, as far as I know. I almost went to the cathedral, that's how stumped I was." "The cathedral?" She frowned. "You know that's a last resort." Yeah, he held up his hands placatingly. "Just saying. Agents working under the scriptures almost never interacted with the temples when working. The sacrosanct status of the temples in nations with secular governments relied on their hands being clean of activities that might be considered interference in political matters, or those threatening the security of the state. It was only in the most dire of emergencies that they would appeal to the local temples for assistance, or to send word in a desperate situation." The sign that the woman asked after was the presence of a scripture member that should have eventually appeared to coordinate the regular regional efforts in their operations. Each agent in that effort ran a cell consisting of mostly unassociated subordinates and associates who were unaware of their true nature and would, as a whole, create a web which collected information to be sent back to their superiors through others that passively drifted through the region. They could be disguised as anything: adventurers, traders, mercenaries, vagabonds. These agents and the information they held would be carried throughout the realms by the currents of trade and travel, like whispers on the wind. It was this vast network that kept the slain theocracy apprised about what went on in the world around them, and many of its knowing participants considered it a sacred duty. His decision to uproot himself from Croston to help set up a new group of cells in the city of Irantal came shortly after its annexation. Agents such as himself worked in a fluid and natural fashion. They would identify gaps in the greater lines of communication that needed to be filled, and those on standby in the region would move independently to do so until those gaps were bridged. At first glance, it seemed like a haphazard way to organize work that generally required meticulous effort, but, in reality, it was extraordinarily difficult to counter. Agents saturated the lands, passively collecting information. Removing a few would simply see the vacancy replaced by others in short order. More often than not, governments simply gave up trying, as it was tantamount to suspecting every single inhabitant in their country of being a spy. There were a few others around the city that he sensed to be similar to himself, intelligence agents from other organizations, which made the absence of their own coordinator all the more puzzling. He or she was supposed to arrive in advance of the others, possibly with additional objectives delivered directly from the upper echelons of the theocracy. As someone with local expertise, Itzal was to collaborate with them to lay out the foundations of the intelligence network in the duchy, but this coordinator had vanished without a trace. More accurately, there wasn't even any evidence that one had even arrived in the first place. A scripture member was a part of the elite core of the slain theocracy and would be much harder to stop than these other agents from lesser nations, so their coordinator should have easily slipped in as well. "Looks like you're in charge for now, then," the woman spoke with expectation, yet there was a question on her face. "No," Itzal shook his head. "Everything set up from last year is gone. We'll work on our own and try to lay as much new groundwork as possible. Let anyone else you see know as well. Whoever finally does arrive will need things working as well as possible when they get here. They can sort everything out later." With that, they split up to start their work. Special orders notwithstanding, the basic role of the information network utilized by the scriptures was always the same. Filter out useful-sounding information and send it on its way. Assist local operations with information gathering, should they require it. Setting up for that alone would take up enough time to see if their coordinator was simply late, but there was still the pressing matter of the resources and funding they should have provided to assist them. Minor agents like Itzal would be able to independently fend for themselves, but financing a broad network of eyes and ears under them was not something that was easily done without acting out of character for their supposed personas, especially now that the impoverished people in the slums had all but vanished. Even so, if they did not act, the information that the theocracy would have to work with regarding the situation in Erantal would be unsubstantiated and possibly filled with harmful rumors and unfiltered hearsay. Itzal's cover was basically that of a layabout mercenary, while the woman looked to be posing as a caravan worker for the Eight Fingers, a criminal syndicate that ruled the increasingly pervasive underworld of Riestais, which in turn was probably posing as a regular merchant caravan. He had hopes that one of the other agents coming in would be a wealthy merchant or something along those lines to smoothen things out financially, but, until then, there was no point in working as a group with essentially no collective resources that could potentially overlap. It would be much easier for each of them to forge small inroads in whatever niche they found to work with, and if one of them was discovered, the rest would be much safer with no traceable coordination to implicate the rest. There were just too many unknowns about the way this strange, inhuman nation functioned, and missteps were bound to happen. Lost in his thoughts over what could be accomplished with so little, he stepped out onto the street and nearly collided with a Death Knight patrolling the street. He stifled a curse and reached for his sidearm, a light mace, before regaining control of himself. The undead horror stopped to stare down at him, as if in anticipation of the most cursory infraction that would give it an excuse to mete out some grisly punishment for challenging public order. Itzal lowered his trembling hands to his sides, and it ran its hateful crimson gaze over him one last time before turning away to resume its beat. Even after nearly a week of being in the city, he still couldn't get used to the damn things. Watching it recede into the distance, Itzal couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the citizens of the city that rose through his disgust. Though somewhat muted in their liveliness, the people simply stood aside and continued on their way whenever they encountered the undead patrols. They had an unbelievable reserve of fortitude when it came to the grim reality that faced them every day. A younger version of himself might have mocked him over the fact that he, a hardened veteran that worked under the theocracy's special forces, was outmatched in mental resilience by the comparatively weak citizens of Erantal. Going by what he could put together, the city folk had been uncertain and fearful initially, with no refuge to flee to that would take them. Unlike the simple laborers of rural territories, which almost always welcomed new hands to help in the fields and forests, the amount of work available in urban areas like cities and towns were entirely dependent on servicing their respective lands and the activity that they attracted. A professional artisan or tradesman could not simply hop over into another community and rob those that had been there long before them of their work. They would have to endure a fresh start at the bottom of the hierarchies of the guilds that regulated them, which did not even guarantee that they would have a way to feed themselves. For the month that followed the kingdom's defeat at Katza Plains, he had watched as those that could uproot themselves passed through Croston, following the royal highway to the west. It had been a veritable flood at first, with the panic that accompanied word of the rout. The wave of refugees slowed to a trickle a few days after the annexation was formalized and the so-called Sorceress Kingdom formally declared itself, But Itzal estimated that several 100,000 had fled over the weeks between. Whether they survived the exodus to find a place in Riastai seemed dubious considering the lawless state of its rural lands. It was a crippling blow to the towns that serviced the larger territories, and it would be even more pronounced in Erantal as the amount of work available would quickly dwindle below what was required to keep the industries of the city afloat. He allowed himself a grim smile at the thought as he continued through the streets. The evil sorcerer king may have announced his benevolent intentions to encourage the regular lives of the people, but the hard reality was that the economy of the region had been hamstrung by the mass depopulation of the land which he had violently wrested away for himself. Even the conditions of the quarter that they had pretentiously removed would simply reappear elsewhere in the city as trade and employment faltered and even more of the citizenry fell into poverty. Itzal did not even need to lift a finger for the inevitable to come to pass. Monsters had no right to rule over men, and Ainz ul Gaon would find this out the hard way as his ill-gotten gains crumbled from his bony grasp.